Hi there, and welcome to this flip presentation on Action Research on University Teaching, Workshop 1. I'm Dr. Emma Kennedy.
And I'm Dr. Antony Aleksiev. Both of us represent educational development.
This presentation is going to give you just a few hints, tips and bits of information that you'll find useful in the workshop.
The topic of our workshop would be action research, and more specifically the kind of research that you can do in relation to your own practice in education. So the question is, what is action research? It's a small-scale research that focuses on educational activity. In your case, that may range from the teaching that you do on any one module, however many sessions that may comprise, or indeed any support-related activity to student learning that you engage in and provide. It can be research that involves collecting data from what you do in the process of doing it, and that would therefore be action research in action. Or it can also be research that's you base on data that you have collected after you have done the work, whatever the activity related to that work might be, and that would be research on action. Ultimately, action research focuses on the improvement or enhancement of your practice.
So you might be thinking, well, how is this action research different from the kind of academic research I do in my day-to-day life? So standard research, in standard research we kind of ask how and why we're investigating a problem for knowledge's sake. It becomes a standalone activity. It's done in addition to teaching. It's separate from your teaching, as you'll see in those of you who have research contracts. Those of you who don't have research contracts will know only too well how separate standard academic research is from your teaching. And it's usually done by research specialists with a long background in the subject. Action research, by contrast, we ask, does it work? So we're not just doing it for the sake of kind of finding out a particular process or for describing something. We're doing it because we have a particular problem that we want to solve. And as such, it's closed loop. So it comes out of your practice as a teacher and it needs to feed back into your practice as a teacher. So it's designed to kind of close the cycle of researching, reflecting and practicing. And it's done by practitioners of teaching. So it's a part of your teaching, it's not a separate part of your contract, and you don't need to have long training in educational theory to do action research on your teaching. Your qualification for doing action research is that you are a practitioner of teaching, although of course we hope that this workshop will also help qualify you additionally.
Some examples of action research to bring to your attention, for instance, that we have been carrying out in educational development, includes the evaluation of impact of our programs in teaching and learning, for example, PGCAP, and that specifically impacts on the individual practice of participants. In other words, how they apply what they learn on these programs into their own teaching and supporting learning when they go back to their school. This is a long-term project because it covers several two-year cohorts, and 2 years is the standard length of programs like PGCAP. The research involves collecting data through questionnaires. It may also include tests on learning gain, which specifically targets measuring the achievement of learning outcomes on the modules that make up these programs by participants. And therefore, as a whole, this type of research can be classified as quantitative because of the nature of the data that are being collected. Another example involves a recently commenced research in educational development of the impact on confidence and student experience of global health placement module. This is a shorter term research. It covers a single module. It involves the deployment of questionnaires and engaging students in interviews to collect the data. And as such, represents an example of mixed methods research. The last example of action research that I want to bring to your attention is the research that we carried out in students' experience of seminars. This involves teaching observations and focus groups, could be across one or more modules. And because of the nature of the data that this research is based on, it is a qualitative type action research. So as you can see, already we have outlined the three main types of action research on the basis of the data that one can use for that research.
So why do people do action research? One reason might be that you've noticed a problem in your teaching and you'd like to find a solution. Another reason, more generally, might be that you're interested in improving your teaching. You know that things are generally going okay, but you think, no, this could be better, or I want to find out what's working, what's not working, and dig a bit deeper to see what I could really target in my practice. A third reason might be that you're on a teaching and scholarship contract, so you'd like to expand your teaching and your scholarship of education accordingly. And start publishing and just generally getting involved in the education community. And action research is a nice, quick, practice-oriented way to do that. Fourthly, more generally, you'd like to get involved in the educational research community. There's a huge community of people researching higher education, ranging from people who are specialists in education to people who are specialists in education in their particular subjects, and also people who have been involved as teachers of the discipline for many years. It's a great, thriving community to get involved in, and action research is a great way to collect data to start getting involved in that conversation. A fifth reason might be that you want to go beyond evaluation. So you might have been teaching for a little while, you've kind of done the whole evaluation thing, and you're continuing to ask your students how things are going and collect data and see the kind of things that are working and not working, but you might be wanting to take a more systematic, a deeper approach to actually find out potentially what students are gaining from certain interventions, or which particular aspects of your practice you think are really sort of in need of improvement, could really be stronger. Finally, last but not least, you might want to raise your profile at QMUL as a teacher. Action research is a great way to do that, because rather than just doing the same as everyone else and evaluating, you're actually collecting data and really able to push the boundaries and innovate as a teacher.
So what do you need for action research? To begin with, you need to start off by formulating a question, and that could be something that you would like to improve in your practice. And here is where your routine evaluations of how things are going in your education-related practice, whether that's teaching or supporting learners in some capacity, can actually help you. And we will try and use a tool that in the workshop that will allow you to consider how you can move on from evaluation of what you do to action researching it. You would also need to consider your participants, the participants in the action research that you have in mind, and that you're formulating the primary hypothesis for through the question that we've just discussed. So, whose experience and or learning do you want to research, really? Usually that would be your students, but equally it could be fellow colleagues from your department, school, faculty, or why not across the university. Then you have to decide what methods or methodology you're going to use in order to organize or rather design your action research. So as we have discussed already on the basis of the examples I gave you previously of action research more generally, and specifically in terms of what we do in educational development, you may decide to design your action research as a qualitative, quantitative or mixed methods research. That very much depends on what you want to do, but primarily it would be a function of your question and the type of data that you need to collect in order to address that question. So, what is it that you want to measure, and what can you measure, really? And last but not least, you need to consider the time and the space in which you can carry out your action research. Now, this is one that we unfortunately can't help with, but you need to schedule your action research alongside all of your other commitments and activities that you carry out as part of your routine work.
So let's talk about the action research cycle. So the first aspect of this cycle might be deciding on what your actual question is. You might think about pressing issues, potentially issues that are coming up in the media, issues that your students have raised, or you might look at existing debates or particular things in the literature. Maybe you've seen a piece of literature where you think, well, that research was useless, or I bet my students don't think that, or even, I think that would be really useful. Let's find out if my students feel that. So all these things, as well as evaluation, as we've just mentioned, will affect what your question is. Next, you want to look at how you're going to research it. So you're going to want to select methods and metrics suited to the question. So if I want to study students' knowledge gain in a particular set of facts, or how much students have learned about anatomy, I might not look at, I might not use qualitative methods. What I might actually do is use a quantitative questionnaire. Equally, if I wanted to research students' kind of personal experience, something that I didn't think would be easily quantified, then I might want to look at more qualitative data. At this point, you might also want to think about the ethical approval that you might need, particularly if you're going to be interviewing students or asking them to participate in focus groups, especially if you're going to be asking them not to be anonymous. So if you want to measure students' gain, you will at least have to pseudonymise the questionnaires. So they'll have to, at very least, do the questionnaires under a false name or under their own name. But obviously, if you're tracking progress over time, you can't have students doing anonymous questionnaires. So it's these kinds of questions that you might have to address when seeking ethical approval to carry out your research. Again, you'll have to consider your timescale and resources. So if you know that you are only going to be teaching for the next semester, don't start a longitudinal study of an entire cohort, because you actually won't have access to the cohort after this semester. So think about, when you're thinking about what you want to do and how you want to do it, also think about, how long am I going to have? Am I going to see these students? Do I have enough access to the students to do the research I want to do? Because this might also be a factor in the kind of research you plan. Once you've decided how, you'll need to carry out your research. And so then we'll be looking at, what does the data actually say? You'll be able to gather your data and analyse that, be that statistical analysis or qualitative analysis, and we'll look at some ways of analysing data later on. And then, what now? So you might have to think about whether you want to publish or present your data, but you also may want to evaluate or research the effects of changes that you've made. So if you've made changes as a result of action research, then you may want to continue the cycle and evaluate their effect. But you'll also need to think about the conclusions from the action research and whether more research is needed, and that might be by you or that might be by someone else.
So let's look at how you formulate a research question, specifically in the context of action research. Now, you can look at the formulation of questions for action research in the context of what it is that these questions are addressing. Perhaps the most common way into doing action research is to align your question with evaluating the effectiveness of your practice. whether that is teaching or supporting learning. And within that, you can look at low scoring areas, as in areas in which your students are underperforming. And by areas, I mean either particular concepts that you have found out through the assessment that students are not getting particularly well with, or indeed specific learning outcomes on the modules or programs that you teach that students are underperforming on, again on the basis of how they achieve in the assessment. You can also look at students' feedback and trends in the comments that you receive year on year, every time, at every iteration of the set of teaching that you deliver on any one particular module. And you can look at any surprising or intriguing results, either in terms of assessment results or in terms of the feedback that you receive. Now, from here, from evaluation, which is specifically related to what you do in your practice, you can indeed decide to formulate a research question that relates to current work in the field, by which I mean the teaching and supporting learning in your, for example, discipline. So you may want to review any recent interesting research, perhaps by replicating it, or you can work on specific questions related to education in your subject. And indeed you can look at institutional or school priorities in terms of how you formulate your action research question. By which I mean considering the effects of recent changes that have been made, and those changes might be policy changes in terms of expectations on you or on the students, or process changes in terms of exactly how the process of, say, assessments, marking and giving feedback is situated in your department. Or you can formulate a research question that effectively allows you to gather evidence for disseminating to your school or the wider university. And you can also carry out action research on the basis of your personal or professional interest, in which case your action research question might be a sort of something that you've been interested in for a long time, purely educationally speaking, something that arises from your past experience of teaching, or indeed as a learner. Something that relates to any career objectives that you may have in the context of education, and any research links that you may have. Another way of looking at how to formulate your research question for action research is to look at specifically what it is that you are asking. So you can formulate the question as an exploratory one, and that would be particularly useful if you were to carry out a pilot study. And an example of such an exploratory question is, what are the most important issues to students around assessment? You can from there move on to a more descriptive type research question. For example, what do second year physics students think is the most important thing about feedback, or how do your Victorian novel students, as in on the module, behave on QMUL+. You can also consider an action research question that explores the relationship between, say, something that you think might be a factor affecting aspects of student learning, and the learning itself, which would be your parameter or variable. For example, you can formulate a question such as, what is the effect of flipping the classroom on a first year biology module? Or something like, did introducing quizzes in my lectures improved student assessment scores. And last but not least, you can be ambitious enough to want to actually explore a causal relationship between what you do in your class and the learning that results from it. This is the so-called explanatory type of action research question, and an example of that would be, why don't students attend office hours? Or indeed, why do students struggle to participate in my English literature seminars?
So once you've formulated your question, you're going to need to make sure that you're not replicating someone else's study, or if you are, that you know you're replicating it. So you're going to want to search the literature around education to make sure that you know who your intellectual antecedents are, as you indeed have been for many years as a researcher. So at the Queen Mary Library, you might use the library catalogue, so putting in your keywords. Make sure to put the full text online filter on the left in the catalogue, otherwise you'll just get lots of reviews of books, as we all know. Queen Mary actually subscribes to a new database, Education Research Complete, which is fantastic, and if you look at the library's e-journals and databases list and just scroll down along the other databases list below the search bar, you'll find Education Research Complete, and that's got loads of fantastic journals. And that includes many discipline-specific education journals, so particularly if you're looking at something in your subject, it's very much worth looking at these discipline-specific journals. And even if you're looking at something more generally, as you will be researching in your subject, it's useful to see what other things people have found related to your subject. You might also look beyond the library. So you might look at Google Scholar, particularly useful for finding out hidden PDFs, something that we might not subscribe to, that someone might have sneakily uploaded elsewhere. But also worth using it with a critical eye, because as we know, some research is worth more than others. So make sure that what you're looking at and treating as proper research is sort of peer-reviewed and well-done research. For explanations of a variety of theories around education and different sort of theoretical frameworks and lenses, you can look at learning-theories.com. This is a free website, but we have checked, and most of what it says about learning theories is accurate. Obviously, learning theories aren't the same as research on learning, but they're useful if you want to, potentially if you're taking a theoretical framework to qualitative research and you want to use the work of a particular theorist, it's always useful to see what this theorist has been seen to say about education in general. And finally, again, explaining and providing useful definitions of concepts are the abstracts in the International Encyclopedia of Education, particularly if concepts come up in the literature, in the proper literature that you're not familiar with. The IE is quite useful to kind of give you some abstracts that define these concepts in a bit more detail.
So let's look at the methodologies for conducting action research, starting off with qualitative methods, possibly less familiar to most of you. Interviews are one often used method for collecting data for qualitative action research. Now, with this method or tool, you can probe individual experiences around your action research question, and also in the principle gather a spectrum of such experiences from representatives of all types of or categories of students that you may have, for example, in your class. Focus groups are another often used method for qualitative action research, in which you can gather an idea of both individual and group level experiences. And importantly, also, you may find that students feel more comfortable to discuss their experiences or share them in a group as opposed to in a one-to-one, particularly if that's one-to-one happens to be with their tutor. You can conduct observations, for example, teaching observations to identify particular patterns that occur in a classroom, or indeed if we're talking specifically your teaching practice, then maybe the observation can be carried out by someone else, or maybe you can video record a session or more that you teach, and then analyze the contents of the video, for which you have to bear in mind that you may actually need to get permission from your students, because inevitably they will be captured in that video. But in the broader sense, you would normally expect an expert observer to be involved in the conducting of that observation. So, for example, teaching observation of you, or to have a focused observation in the sense that there are specific things that are being looked for in what is happening in the classroom. And then, of course, you have things like written accounts that you can use in order to gather data for a qualitative action research. They're fairly easy to collect and anonymize. And you can, for example, in that context, analyze written assessments. That will give you an idea of the level of understanding or learning that your students are experiencing, or you can ask your students for feedback on any one particular session through some very simple feedback gathering forms that we can help you with or show you an example of that we use on our sessions on the programs we conduct, teach in educational development.
Okay, and as well as qualitative methods, there are some methods that many of you would be more familiar with, and you'll be glad to know that are very useful in action research, and those are quantitative methods. So one method you might use, is particularly if you're delivering questionnaires, is getting students to rate things on a scale potentially of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, or from sort of excellent to very bad, those kind of scales. So the most common is a Likert scale. You may also want students to rate something true or false, potentially either a sort of binary or on a sort of continuous scale from true to false. So one of the things you'll have to decide is whether you want students to be able to rate something continuously, or whether you want to limit the number of discrete options that they can collect, bearing in mind that you'll have to do statistical analysis on this. So you may want to consider whether you want to give students too many options, or whether you want to divide them into particular categories. You could also get students to rank particular things. So, for example, if you wanted to see how important certain aspects of feedback were, you might decide to give them already aspects of feedback and then get them to rank those in terms of importance. That's particularly useful if you don't have time to do lots of research or lots of sort of qualitative research, or lots of focus groups or interviews, and instead you want to get a sense of things that maybe are hard to quantify, but you still want to use a quantitative method. Another one that comes under quantitative is using numerical assessment results. So you might want to directly use marks and grades, or you might want to potentially, where assessments don't align with what you want to assess, you might use your own alternative assessment scale. So, for example, you might analyse students' written tests for particular things that you weren't necessarily testing and grading in the assessment or rewarding in the assessment, but that you wanted to research whether or not they were doing. And then hopefully after the research you might reflect on whether you should be assessing those things. And again, this might be a way in which you would want to consider the marking criteria. So does it measure what you want to measure in the research? And if not, is there something important enough that you want to research it that you are not measuring in your assessment? And do you want to change that? You might want to do pre-post tests, so if you want to test the effectiveness of a particular intervention, for example a flipped classroom or a quiz in a lecture, you might want to test so to give yourself a kind of baseline, and then to test the extent to which your intervention improved student results. Educational research can be quite difficult in that we don't usually have a control group, so having a pre and post tests is one way to kind of make up for that a little bit. So consider what to test, but you may also want to balance rigour with test fatigue. So if you want to test the effectiveness of quizzes in lectures, do you want to have a pre-post lecture test every week on the 12 weeks of your module, or do you want to consider which quizzes are the most interesting that you'd like to research, or which lectures will have quizzes on particular things? Finally, you might look at numerical analytics. So for example, QMUL or QEngage is another platform. So I know from QMUL it's relatively easy to collect and analyse particular data, so how much student access certain things, how much time they spend on it. But of course, as with anything, you'll want to have a critical eye, particularly for internet analytics. So how reliable actually are they? Just because QMUL tells me that a student spent an hour on a quiz, does it mean they sat and did the quiz for an hour, or does it mean they actually just clicked on the quiz and then left? So think about how reliable these analytics are, and what do they tell you. But they're nevertheless quite useful.
So the last group of methods which have been mentioned thus far, and which we conclude sort of run through the methodology for conducting action research, are the mixed methods, and as the name suggests, they're basically a combination of quantitative and qualitative methods. The main question there for you would be where to position which type of methods in the context of your research design. So you may want to have your quantitative methods or methods first, then follow that up with qualitative methods. For example, you can gather broad data to identify the key themes, and then use qualitative methodology to sort of delve further into the specifics around those themes and explore, for example, more moving away from the quantitative data, more specifically feelings or attitudes towards the any aspect of the question that you are researching, really. You can have instead qualitative methods first, followed by quantitative methods. So you can do an exploratory study to gather some idea of what student attitudes might be, in order to design a quantitative study in a particular way that is guided by your findings from the exploratory study. And equally, you may decide to intersperse your action research design with either one of these two main categories of methods. You can use a qualitative method to probe deeper into the experience of at multiple stages, whilst at the same time you gather and generate quantitative data that would give you the opportunity to examine and explore any overriding trends in, say, your student performance, your student learning, student attitudes, and so on and so forth.
So now that we've looked at some ways of collecting data, we're going to think about analysing data and drawing conclusions. So you might want to think critically about the strengths and weaknesses of your chosen methods. You might, and again this comes down to kind of time and resources, what tools or assistance might you need for analysis? So you might need software to analyse your statistics, SPSS potentially. You might want to look at transcribing, either you as a transcriber, which takes time, or potentially if you have some funding you could pay someone else to do it. You might even need a statistician. Don't we all need a handy statistician? Does your analytical approach provide valid and reliable data? So you're going to need to test that, especially if you want to publish your data. So for multiple choice questions, you might use Cronbach's Alpha, and we've got a link to a useful video there. What can you conclude on the basis of this analysis? Are these findings valid? are they credible? And then once you know that they are credible, we hope, what meaning and significance do they have for your practice? What changes do you think you might want to implement as a result of them? And what recommendations can you make? So you might want to change your own practice, but you might also be publishing more broadly, particularly if you've been speaking to sort of a departmental or even a Queen Mary-wide policy.
So if you decide to go with a quantitative research design, that will generate data which are by definition quantitative themselves, and in that instance normally you would be expected to produce descriptive statistics that go with your analysis of the data, and those statistics often include the means, that would be the standard average of your data set, the standard deviations, ranges of your means, and so on. So those would have been calculated for the observations and measures that you have conducted as part of your quantitative research. For example, your pre and post tests of your study design. You would have to then specify what statistical test or tests you would use or have used, particularly in the write-up of your research. For example, for study designs with categorical data, so groups, and those data would be values or observations that can be sorted into groups or categories. And if that data applies to the independent variable, so the one that is presumably the factor influencing whatever it is that you are examining in your actual research, your dependent variable then may be characterized with what we call continuous information, continuous data. For example, that could be the amount of time students spend online using the resources that you have prepared, and so on. But in these instances, you may have to use either t-tests to compare between two separate populations of data, for example, two different classes of students that you teach, one of which may be your control group or class, and the other one may be your experimental group, in which case in the experimental group you may be doing something differently to the control group. Or you can also use tests that relate to analysis of variance. So where you have combination of factors, independent variables, that you want to examine in relation to your dependent variable, so the thing that you actually want to know about, like student learning, for example, you would normally consider both the interaction and the main effects of the independent variables on the dependent variable. And therefore that needs to be taken into consideration in the analysis of variance that you conduct. If your data is not normally distributed, which effectively means it doesn't have that bell-shaped curve, if you plot all of the data points, you can use non-parametric tests. This is just a test that is very similar to, say, for example, a t-test, but has it's less statistically strong in terms of detecting a difference. Or you can transform your data, for example, by recalculated sort of log transform it, as we call it, to make them normally distributed or as close to normal distribution as possible.
So in qualitative research, you may also want to analyse your data, and there are a few different ways to do this. One of the most common is coding, so organising your data by bracketing chunks, so potentially segments of a text, and using a word to represent a category in the margins, so almost like tagging particular things. So you might you'll start with your raw data, and then you'll prepare it for analysis. So potentially you might clean up your transcripts or your notes, read through it all, and then you'll be coding the data either by hand, and that's usually how I do it because it's easier, or you might have a computer program that actually identifies sentences with particular words or themes. And then you can look at how often particular themes come up and how different people actually use particular themes, or what participants are saying. And potentially one interesting thing is that participants will actually use particular language to describe concepts. So it may be that something comes up that's not surprising, but the way in which participants talk about it, or the way they refer to it, is intriguing.
So how might you use your findings, the findings that your action research has generated? You need to decide who needs to know about the outcomes from your research, whether you can publish or instead present, or both, whether and how to share with your colleagues, for example, in your department, whether you would be interested or think it might be useful to present the findings to a teaching conference, for example, a disciplinary one that may have been organized either in your department or school or at a national level, and for most, if not all, of subjects taught academically in the UK, there would be normally at least one annually such conference. Or indeed, you can consider also presenting your results from the research that you undertook at the annual Learning and Teaching Conference that is organised here at Queen Mary. You can improve your own practice by considering the results from your research, and most of the time you actually decide to conduct action research with the very idea of using these results towards enhancing your own practice, in which case useful questions to ask yourself would be what actions you can actually take. So what would you change in your practice, and how? And indeed, if you want to be consistent, given that you're making these changes on the back of action research that you have designed and undertaken, also think about how might you evaluate the outcomes from those changes themselves. Which brings me to the second option listed. Do you need to do more research or just evaluation? And what further directions or interventions might you want to consider?
Thank you very much for listening. Now we're going to just give you a brief intro to the workshop. So after the workshop, our learning outcomes are that you'll be able to define action research in the context of teaching practice. Hopefully you've got quite far towards that today. Formulating a feasible research question that relates to and produces a desirable outcome for your teaching practice, and select an appropriate methodology for research and an indicator of success that might fit into a study design to answer the question in 2. So to prepare for the workshop, we want you to think about what you might research and why you want to do it. Then in the workshop, using some of the concepts we've introduced here, as well as everything that you bring to the workshop, your ideas and of course your current practice, we're going to hopefully move you towards having a feasible research question and a methodology and a study design ready potentially to pilot. So that's all for now. Please feel free to go back through the slides if you've already forgotten anything that I've just mentioned. That's totally fine. And Antony and I will see you later in November.